right, so today I'd like to talk about energy weapons. I realize that the topic of energy weapons is kind of a strange topic. It's very abnormal. Given that we constantly have arguments about Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, and how that relates into gun laws or gun restriction or gun control policies that we've been arguing about since the 90s, and not to mention the California fires over the last 2 or 3 years, coupled with North Korea's threatening the U.S. with nuclear ballistic missiles, along with Iran threatening to resume their nuclear missile program. So anyways, it occurred to me that a lot of these subjects seem to be like rehashes of debates from like 20, 30 years ago. The state of weapons have dramatically changed since, even the laws have changed quite a bit. So like a lot of the arguments that I'm hearing would have something to do with like, oh, well, we need to ration guns the same way we ration Advil or sinus medication or something. And I'm looking at them going like, what the hell are you talking about, dude? Advil? Seriously? You mean like one bottle per gun? Or I don't know. What are you trying to get at here? A lot of the gun control laws just simply want to make the guns less effective. So that everything from reducing the number of bullets in a handgun to not having fully automatic rifles to semi-automatic rifles to eventually try to convert everything into like a BB gun, essentially. And it's strange because in the 90s, when everyone was talking about this, we quickly found out the alternative to guns, which are much more precise than, say, a bomb or arson, i.e. fire, or a Molotov cocktail where you just, light a liquor bottle on fire with a rag and you throw it at a building, hopefully have some wood shingles, and the whole thing will burn. I mean, like, I remember in high school when the high schools used to get a lot of bomb threats after the Timothy McVeigh bombing. There was a lot of copycats, what they called it. So kids would be watching TV, in between commercials, the news would pop up, red alert or news event, breaking news. The Oklahoma City bombing happened. Then in the weeks and months following the bombing, you learned about Timothy McVeigh, fertilizer bombs, and you're kind of scratching your head. You can turn fertilizer into a bomb? Wow, I never knew that. And then all the conspiracy theories came out with it. And then, one kid would pipe up and say, hey, have you seen the Anarchist Cookbook? And then it outlines like every kind of homemade bomb you can make. Apparently it was circulated in the 60s, but then all of a sudden everyone gets a copy of the Anarchist Cookbook, and then the schools start banning the Anarchist Cookbook because they're like, hey, you're not allowed to build bombs at school. And not too long after that, a bunch of kids got the wise idea that, hey, you know what, maybe I don't want to go to school today. Maybe I'll just make a bomb threat and just call in to the school and say, hey, there's a bomb in room 403, and then the whole school would get evacuated. After this happened successfully once, twice, 3 times, then other kids would get the idea, and they would copycat the tactic of ditching school by calling in bomb threats or pulling the fire alarm or calling the cops for random things. Today you have something more like swatting, where Xbox kids will be playing, somebody starts mouthing off to the other kid, the kid doesn't like it, so he'll call the cops and threaten that there's a bomb or a murder suspect or something happened at the other kid's house. The SWAT team would come storm that kid's house. And so just the mere threat of a bomb or a murder or a crime or something was enough to bring real people with real guns to your door. And so like there was a huge concerted effort where like all of a sudden the parents get mad. They're like, oh, what are you teaching our kids at school? Somebody please think about the children. Even though it's the children that are pulling the pranks, that are calling in the threats and pulling the fire alarms. And so then eventually there was a lot of, at least in Southern California, there was a lot of gang activity, and there was a lot of kids bringing actual weapons to school. And so then they started putting up metal detectors, and then for different reasons kids didn't like that there was a metal detector, and they would find ways around the metal detector to where all of a sudden they weren't keeping guns out, but rather they were keeping guns in. Like kids would go like, for instance, like a quick way around a metal detector would be like the night before or over the weekend, you go bury whatever object you don't want them finding into the football field or the baseball field somewhere, and then you walk through the metal detector, no problem, and then you go dig up your item during the time that you actually wanted to use it, and now you got a real problem. Except now you got like dudes with metal detectors going over the field looking for metal objects as if this was prison or something. Like all of a sudden kids have contraband and stuff. And eventually, some of the kids that were getting smart, they're like, you know what? You don't need metal to make a weapon. Any stick, any rock or heavy object, anything you could drop on your foot and it would hurt would work just like. And so like to the point where they're saying, hey, look, these pencils, they could be used like a weapon. Didn't we confiscate all pencils and therefore we can't do our homework because you're afraid of weapons? The wrestlers and the football players would always laugh at this. They're like, well, technically, my hands are a weapon. Like, this is all we do all day is we practice fighting all day long. And, the football players would laugh at the wrestlers because they're like, yeah, you might have like a one-on-one fight. We're used to gang fights. Like, it's 22 people on the field at a time. Like, we used to do like Bull in the Ring where you put one guy in the middle of a circle of like 20 dudes and then the coach would call out somebody's number and he'd go smash the dude in the middle. And it only took like 3 or 4 hits before the guy in the middle would run out of steam, and then he would get very shaky. That's when things get dangerous, is because when you're tired, it's very hard to take a hit, let alone deliver one. And so like you had all these weird elements at school where you're like, on one hand, you're teaching fighting to kids, i.e. wrestling, football, and there's regular sports, plus there's regular gangbangers hanging around. There's stoners, kids doing drugs at school, and they're not necessarily in their right mind all the time. And drug dealers, like the said gangbangers might be selling drugs to the stoner. And if any of these guys were on the football or the wrestling team, they might get in a fight too quick, or they might get expelled from the school and or team because of gang activities or low tolerance or zero tolerance. A lot of the joke is like, if you're really worried about violence or gangs or weapons or drugs, don't go to school. That's the last place to go, because that's just that's like prison. You're just asking to get in a fight. So no wonder kids were like pulling the fire alarm or calling in bomb threats to get out of school. A, it's boring, but B, it's also kind of dangerous depending on which high school you were going to. Around that time, I happened to be taking jewelry. A lot of other kids were taking shop, or I took shop too. But so you're working around like high-powered machines, so like bandsaws and all kinds of different machines that rotated at a high rate with a blade on it. If you're talking about jewelry, you're actually hanging around and you have like a torch. You're like, oh yeah, I'm going to melt some gold today, or I'm going to melt down some silver or some platinum, or I'm going to whip out the jeweler saw and I'm going to do some casting, and then I'm going to do some other stuff. Eventually, I turned into like PA, and so then my job was to move the propane canisters around, and they still wouldn't let the TAs touch the oxyacetylene canisters because that gets wicked hot, wicked fast. It's so unstable. If you just like pushed it over, it's like a giant bomb that would blow up like that wing of the school, or at least catch it on fire really fast. And it was strange because you're like spending all this time and effort trying to keep, knives out of the school. Yet there's other kids walking around with, saws and hand tools and propane tanks and torches. And you're kind of going like, what are we doing here? Really? Like, really, guys? One of the funnier jokes was that you could take super glue. I guess it basically burns like napalm. And so you can like slather anything you wanted with super glue and then maybe put like a wax fuse on it, light the wax fuse, and it would go light up the super glue, and it would just burn really, really hot, and you can't put it out. And so you're like, oh, oh no. Of course, the smart kids that were in the chemistry classes are like, oh, did you know like you can mix some of these chemicals together and create a fire? Or you could just use like nitrous oxide, or there's all kinds of different things. You can like gas a room, or you could freeze something, or superheat something, or there was all kinds of dangerous devices there, and it wasn't very well secured. It was just like the honor system was what we were doing. The other thing that kids were playing with were those like laser pointers. Everyone had like a laser pointer. They got really dangerous because everyone kept flicking them at each other, and it would go into other kids' eyes. And it's like, well, if you're just pointing at a wall and it's only a 5-watt laser, it's not a big deal. But if you point it at someone's eyeball, that's enough to make them temporarily sunblind or something. Other kids got the wise idea. It's like, oh, if I just flip off the cap here and adjust the focal point, I could turn this into a burning laser. Granted, it's not a very hot burning laser, like you're just barely etching into wood or into your sneakers, some name or something. But the bigger point is you're like, oh, we have lasers. We can make laser weapons, or a lot of kids wanted to make lightsabers somehow, and nobody really figured that one out. But the bigger point is that like kids are pretty inventive, and if left to their own devices, they're going to make weapons way worse than guns or knives. I remember in scout camp we used to take bug spray, and we would light a match, and then when you would spray the bug spray on the match, and you'd create a makeshift blowtorch. Or you'd go into the woods and you'd pick up some sticks and you start trying to fashion a bow and arrow. And then, until you got to the archery merit badge, and then you'd go pick up a proper bow and arrow. And then you get the wise idea is like, oh, let me put some super glue on the end of this arrow and let's make flaming arrows and just shoot them around in the you're in the forest, but I think technically at that time it was a desert, so it was a very low. It wasn't like you're going to create a forest fire in this particular area, but the point is that we were like flaming arrows. Also, during this time in the 80s and 90s, I remember the Reagan administration going on TV and talking about Star Wars and how they were going to put up satellites with lasers to shoot down nuclear weapons, which I didn't really think too much of until later on when I lived in the Bay Area, and I would drive by Lawrence Livermore Labs a lot, like on a daily basis on my commute into Google or someplace, or into San Francisco. And I forgot that, oh yeah, Lawrence Livermore Labs, they're in charge of the nuclear stockpile. And by the way, did you know that they've already invented nukes? So what have they been doing for the last 50 years? So they were in charge of the nuclear stockpile. So in addition to being stewards of the stockpile, they would have to maneuver the nuclear material around so that foreign governments wouldn't necessarily know where it's at. But that's super risky to move nuclear material around. But it was also to then design new weapons with nukes, something that you'd see there, a higher yield bomb, like going from the atom bomb to the hydrogen bomb, or I forget which one's more powerful. But anyways, going from one bomb to the next, or smart bombs. So these would be missile-guided bombs that have GPS on it. Or it might be, I think in the first Iraq War in the 90s, they had the uranium-tipped shells. So then this way, these were for tank armor-piercing shells. So when you're having a tank fight, supposedly that's what they were doing back in Iraq 1 and 2, was then you would want to destroy the enemy tank, and with spent uranium, you could actually tip the mortar, and it would just pierce right through the enemy tank's armor in like a hot knife through butter. So they're like, oh, well, this is super great. So this led to the Gulf War syndrome. So a bunch of service people during that war came back claiming that they had some sort of radiation poisoning or contamination, and suffered a lot of problems from that because they didn't realize that those armor-piercing bullet shells were actually, not bullet shells, but like tank shells, were actually uranium tipped. So one of the other things that the lab was known for was because they were kind of like going like, okay, well, what else can you do with nukes? So you're like, well, shooting them is one thing, right? So before ballistic nuclear missiles, they had just conventional arms where they would just fire a missile with a nuke, or they would just drop a nuclear bomb on a given target. It didn't even deliver itself. So they would, by putting it on a rocket and or a self-guiding missile, or a ballistic one that would actually go intercontinental, or maybe one that could fire from a sub underneath the water and then launch itself and then guide itself to a designated target intercontinentally, that would make it a much more lethal weapon, because then you didn't need a nuclear silo to house and store and launch the thing. You could actually put it on a sub, float the sub anywhere you want in the ocean. Nobody could find it. Prior to that, they were experimenting with putting nukes on trains. So the idea was something like nuclear football, I think is what they called it, where they would basically have like one out of like 10 or 15 train carts that had nuclear armaments on it. And then they would move these things around the U.S. so that you never knew where the actual football was. It was like a big grand game of shell game. And even if you found one of these 10 trains that might have had a nuclear missile on it, so you might knock out the train tracks in front and the train tracks behind the train cart, there was a 1 out of 10 chance that there was actually a nuke on it. But two, each one of these things were also armed with like armed personnel, and they were designed to last for like, a good 10-20 minutes before the Air Force would send in a strike unit and destroy anyone that was attacking the football, and then they would send in personnel to go recover the football. So there was a movie about that called Broken Arrow, I think, except it wasn't necessarily a train car. This is before the nuclear subs, and then that kind of obsoleted the need for multiple train carts to carry nuclear armaments on it, or even having too many silos where the enemy's military can map out where each one of these silos were, and you couldn't move it. So subs were a huge thing on that. In terms of defense, with the Reagan Star Wars, they were basically saying like, oh yeah, well, if the enemy did fire a nuke at us, we want to be able to shoot it down. So they got to work on Star Wars, which were lasers. So it turned out like Lawrence Livermore Labs was working on lasers quite a bit. So in addition to helping create devices, and it wasn't just Lawrence Livermore Labs, I'm sure Lockheed and Boeing, and maybe not Boeing, but Northrop Grumman, I forget all the defense contractors. They've all changed names so many times I can't keep track of them anymore. But anyways, they all had a hand in designing all these different systems based off of whatever the requirements were. But in Livermore's case, they were going like, well, okay, so we still need to make military grade laser. What else can you do with the lasers as it relates to nukes? And so they're like, oh, well, how about we create NAFT or NIFT, which was basically a project where they were trying to use lasers to create fusion or fission. I forget which one's which. But basically do what the inside of a star does, where you create so much heat that you actually break apart matter, or atoms. And the release of that, the broken matter or atoms would release energy. And hopefully it would be more energy than what it took, what you put in to create the heat in the first place. So they created like a baseball stadium sized lab that held 365 lasers so literally in a circle, and they would have a piece of matter or element that would be no bigger than like a dime, and all 365 lasers, and these are high powered lasers, and that's why they weren't able to put it all in one laser, was that each laser was so high powered and so much energy being focused in it, it would actually melt. So to distribute the heat, they would make 365 of them and synchronize them all to fire at the same time, up to 8 or 10 bursts. So at this dime at the center of the football field, and try to heat it up so much to the point where the matter would get destroyed, converting the matter back into energy, and hopefully that energy is greater than the energy used to power the lasers and to fire the lasers. Apparently that's still going. I don't know if they've actually achieved it. They keep complaining about gravity. Gravity is so strong that all this metal that we're using to hold these giant lasers into place at elevation to shoot down on this thing is actually bending the metals, and so it throws it off just enough. All the lasers are not hitting the exact spot at the exact time, so they are constantly calibrating their lasers to fire in sequence at a very, very small spot. And the smaller the spot is, the more heat they can generate, and therefore the less energy it takes to actually break apart the matter. And therefore you don't necessarily need uranium or what's the other one? Plutonium, I think. But yeah, so you don't necessarily need to go gather these rare earth minerals, enrich them in a giant centrifuge, create small cities to do the enrichment in secret or underground, like you did in the Manhattan Project, or what Iran's currently doing, or what other nations, even North Korea, all these different places are drilling holes in the side of a mountain to put underground nuclear weapons programs to A, test the nuclear weapons, but B, enrich the uranium, or to assemble them, or to conceal their activities. So rather than doing all that, you're like, oh, so we could just use lasers We just have to heat something up really, really, really hot until the matter disintegrates and turns back into energy. And then we would get the equivalent of a nuclear blast or the nuclear reactor or i.e. fusion or fission. I always forget which one's which. One's breaking them apart, the other one's putting them together. But anyways, so you would get the equivalent of a nuclear reactor with just light. Energy weapon. I kind of forgot about all this until the California fires started sparking up in the last 2 or 3 years. And it was strange because California had, I remember in the 90s, it was El Nino and La Nina, and you'd see Chris Farley get up on SNL and, dance around like, because if El Nino means little boy or the boy and La Nina means the girl, then, Chris Farley, a big fat guy, is dancing around going like, I am the Nino, which is Spanish for the Nino, and, insert comedy here. And it was because there was so much rain that we were getting flooded out. In 2010 to 2014, we actually had a drought. And you would have thought fires would have happened during the drought time, but post 2014 to 2018, the last 3 years straight, we've had massive statewide fires. Nobody knows why. But, some of the conspiracy theories is that either some guy went out around in the meadows and started committing arson. That's always been around. That's usually happens during fire seasons, and that never created a statewide fire inferno thing. So I don't think that's really the case. Some of the other conspiracy theories were like, oh, the government is using high energy weapons and targeting houses that they want to redevelop and turn into, I don't know if it was the government, but maybe it was rich guys or developers who wanted to burn up like very expensive areas, get rid of all the old housing, collect the insurance money, either build new housing or just take the money and run. Or maybe other countries wanted to burn it. I don't know. There's a bunch of speculation, and it all definitely seems very fishy. However, it did remind me, oh yeah, we have these things called energy weapons. And one of the other things that I remember that Lawrence Livermore was talking about was using lasers for, say, medical, meaning that if you had like, say, a brain tumor or brain cancer or something like that, and in order for them to operate and remove the tumor or the cancer, was that they would have to cut open your scalp, open up your skull with a bone saw, like Hannibal Lecter style, then cut through healthy brain tissue until they got down into where the tumor was at in order to cut it out and extract. So all that healthy tissue that they're cutting through, it might be your childhood, it might be your 20s, it might be your PhD, it might be all the memories of your kids or something like that. And this is provided that you survive the brain surgery. But they were saying like, okay, well, what if we were able to harness the power of microwaves or even photons, because light can actually pass through matter, so can radio waves. The thing is that it'll, depending on what the matter is, it'll lose energy as it passes through, depending on the frequency. So like a lot of radio waves can go through a building with almost no energy loss. Light will lose a whole bunch, but it can go through things like glass, for instance, or water, or other translucent material. So they were like, what if if you put light to the end of your fingertips, like a flashlight, your fingertips will actually glow because the light's actually is going through your skin to a degree, and your skin is able to absorb the light and convert that into vitamin D and all kinds of interesting things. But they were thinking like, well, what if you could use a laser or a microwave or something like that and shoot an energy beam to the tumor so it'll pass through your scalp, your skull, and all the healthy brain tissue, and actually microwave or nuke as in, sorry, I'm referring to the microwave, but like, heat up and disintegrate the tumor itself. And then you would let the tumor burn out without burning all the healthy tissue, and then your blood supply would take the dead parts and move that out. It'll just dissolve out over time like a regular infection or something. And so they're going like, well, that's a really interesting medical way of doing that, right? Like, this is not too dissimilar from how a CAT scan or an MRI might work, or a CT scan, where they use they give you electromagnetic dye that will light up, that's radioactive. Then they'll put you into a giant magnet, and then they'll use resonance to create an image of what your internal organs look like. And so they're kind of experimenting with these different things for medical reasons, but then there's military reasons why you'd use this. Not just making a laser that can cut down a missile or an airplane or whatever, but what if you had that tank, instead of using spent uranium-tipped shells to fire at this tank and destroy the tank, and therefore the tank operator and that tank's ability to conduct war, what if you could use one of these energy weapons to microwave the tank driver or whatever biological organism that's inside the tank? So any person in the tank, they all get microwaved. Like if you put some chicken in your microwave, what if you could just microwave that, and then you calmly walk over to the tank and then unlock it and then you add the tank to your arsenal after you clean it out, obviously, without destroying the tank. And that reminds me of I don't know if they're conspiracy theories, but there's a lot of, not even just environmentalist concerns about 4G and 5G, but just concerns about how much radiation are we giving ourselves with Wi-Fi or with Bluetooth or with 5G or just being around power lines in general. That reminds me of the Tesla coils, right? Where back in the day, Tesla was arguing against, say, an Einstein character about the development of nuclear weapons, because I think Einstein wrote a letter to the president saying, hey, we need to develop nuclear weapons before the Germans do, or before the Chinese, or before the Russians do, and the first one to get there is going to be kind of in control of things, and so therefore we should accelerate the development of nuclear weapons. Nikola Tesla, actually said something along the lines of, well, if you had a stronger defense, you wouldn't need nuclear weapons to attack people with, right? So you wouldn't need those deterrents if you had a really strong defense. So his solution was the Tesla coil, where basically it's a tower with a copper wire wrapped around it, and then you run electricity through it, which creates an electromagnetic field. And so then anything electromagnetic would be disturbing the field and would actually create a connection. So for instance, they were saying you could take a Tesla coil, put it out into a field, and all the flies and insects and mosquitoes, and as they moved around, because they still attract electricity, will get zapped. So it's like a giant bug zapper, except if you make it big enough and with enough electricity, you can turn it into a person zapper or a dog zapper or an animal zapper. And so these Tesla coils were meant to, you create a perimeter around whatever you wanted. You didn't need a guard standing there all the time with a gun and a sniper and the whole thing. It'll just zap anybody who tries to breach your perimeter. Furthermore, this is kind of how lightning works. So when the storm clouds come in, you have natural lightning storms, but that's basically just the electronic ions coming from the ionosphere that is connecting through the water, because water is hyper conductive for electricity. So the electrons will be conducted through, just like if you were using the copper coils, which is also highly conductive, but the water vapor itself is conductive enough to create an electrical current. And then if the vapor between the cloud and the ground is thick enough or is humid enough, it can actually create a direct line to the ground. So like a tree, or if you had a lightning rod on top of a house and it's higher than the other lightning rods or the other things that would attract the electrons, you would zap the lightning rod instead of a person or a house, i.e. the expression lightning doesn't strike twice sort of thing. But you're trying to get it to hit the lightning rod. I think that's what Benjamin Franklin figured out by flying a kite up to the sky and put a key on it, that he was able to have lightning hit the kite, and therefore he can free electricity from the ion. It's pretty trippy when you think about it, because that's actually how 4 or 5G works, or the cell phone towers, or even radio towers, where basically you have the electromagnetic field. There's different there's different lightning rods. So your human body actually acts like a lightning rod, but your cell phone has a receiver. So the human body, just like the phone, is a receiver. It will create a connection between you and the tower. Through the tower that's emitting these radio waves, the receiver picks it up and decodes the radio waves into messages. And then when the receiver, if it has a transmitter as well, which they do, will send information back to the radio tower or the cell phone tower, which creates two-way communication, but it also creates a type of GPS, not global positioning like from the satellites, but it would be able to create a radion between you and the tower, and if it knows what the degree, if you're like 10 degrees north or 5 degrees south or something like that, it can draw a triangle between you and the tower and then figure out how far you are through the radion. And then in this way, this is like radar, where you can see bogeys coming in and out. Radar just does it on a grander scale where they're looking for larger objects like planes or birds or something like that. But on a smaller scale, like a cell phone tower does something similar. So technically, you're getting zapped with energy, just like the Tesla tower. Except, and technically, now that I think about it, Tesla, when he was first creating these Tesla towers, initially made wireless communication by creating a Tesla tower and disguising it as wireless communication. He wasn't telling his investors that he was trying to create wireless energy transfer, which technically it is, which then could technically be used for defense, but he was telling his investors it could be used for communication, and therefore it could be like a telco, and it would replace all the wires that came from the previous couple of decades where they wired up Hoover Dam and Niagara Falls to all across the U.S. to transfer electricity. He was basically saying, hey, like, what if I could power every device that falls within my Tesla coil? Subsequently, also create two-way telecommunication, i.e. Mobile phones. And he figured this out back in the early 19th century or something. And it only works because we are already in a giant electromagnetic field, i.e. the ionosphere. So like if you were to take the Earth, for instance, and the fact that it has molten lava at the center of it, and because it's hot, the hotter elements of the lava, heat goes up or flows up because it's lighter. And so as the heat moves the lava up, it creates a vacuum beneath it and sucks in the colder lava in the opposite direction to fill its spot, because it creates a pump. And as it hits the Earth's crust, where it cools, it'll start to circumnavigate the Earth's crust, i.e. flow around from the North Pole down to the South Pole, and then it will sink back in, because it's been cooled now, into the South Pole, and then go back to its original spot. But it's going in 360 degrees like an apple core, or a donut might be another way to do it, but I think it looks more like an apple core. And this is why you have a North Pole and a South Pole, is because of the way the lava is flowing from the center of the core outwardly. And then because all this is moving so much metallic objects around, i.e. lava, it's throwing off a lot of electrons, which then creates the ionosphere, which acts like a giant force field to protect the Earth atmosphere from being blown away by the sun's solar flares or the solar wind. And so where the force field is at its weakest is the North Pole or the South Pole, and they call this the solar lights. That's where the solar wind is actually hitting the atmosphere, because there's not enough force field there to prevent it from actually hitting the atmosphere. So that's why it heats up and lights up and catches on fire and creates a solar light. But the rest of the world, you're protected by this giant force field. So we're walking around in a giant electromagnetic field with a lot of little fields, i.e. these cell phone towers or Wi-Fi in your pocket. This is actually why Bluetooth works. Like you could have one phone, you don't have to centralize everything through a big tower. You could just have one device go directly to another device. So instead of like Wi-Fi that goes through a router, you could have your MacBook talk to your iPhone through Bluetooth. It's just a different frequency on the electromagnetic wave. So it's like, oh, okay, so I don't have to send up a file to the tower or the router and then send it back down to the iPhone. I could see that there's an iPhone right next to me and then create a connection between the two of us, as long as we don't walk away too far away. Like Bluetooth is like 15 to 30 feet, whereas Wi-Fi is like 40 to 50 or 60 feet. I think it's more like 40, but whatever. But you can daisy chain your Wi-Fi routers to create a network or a mesh network that covers a greater area. So if you're near router A, it can relay the information to router B or C or D. But all your devices are technically able to connect to themselves or to each other's and never touch the router. So that's also a mesh network. And it's interesting because with the wireless energy transfer, supposedly what you could do if you had like some copper wire, for instance, inside like on two adjacent walls of, say, like your house, on both walls, you put in the copper wire inside the wall, you run electricity through it, and then anything between the two adjacent walls, it'll create what looks like a serpentine, similar to the Earth's ionosphere, but like a big giant 8 figure or an apple core. And anything inside those two spheres or those two rings, energy is flowing back and forth. So if you put your iPhone in between those two rings, you could technically remove the battery and your phone would still work because it would be getting enough electricity from the air wirelessly. And so this is what Tesla was saying back in the 19th century, i.e. wireless energy transfer, telecommunication, defense. So I'm kind of wondering, I was wondering not too long ago, it's like, well, are there energy weapons? What happened to Reagan's Star Wars? And technically, we still have nukes that still generates a lot of electricity at a nuclear power plant. We still have nuclear ballistic missiles. We still have satellites that still talk to radio towers that still send stuff over both the wire but also wirelessly, or relays it through a series of cell phone towers. And so then you're kind of going like, part of me is wondering, is like, well, what's stopping them from turning those telephone towers into Tesla coils in the defensive term, meaning that they could just put enough electricity through there where it just starts zapping bugs or small cats and dogs, and you can create a perimeter around an area without any bullets or guns or soldiers. You just use these Tesla towers or the cell phone towers as a defense mechanism, as a virtual wall. But then because you have all that electricity flowing through, you could either use it as the virtual wall that will zap everything. You could also use it as a way to do wireless energy transfer. So it's kind of crazy because those towers could be defensive, they could be offensive, they could be facilitate communication all at the same time. And when I really start to think about it, I start thinking about thunder and lightning again. I'm going like, well, how hard would it be to manipulate the sky in such a way where you can rain down lightning anywhere you want using the energy already in the Earth's ionosphere? That part I don't know, but there's a lot of stuff around HAARP, I think was the military program for manipulating, the weather or the clouds or things like that. The NSA had a lot of programs around intercepting data from in between satellites or through wireless mechanisms or bouncing signals off of the ionosphere or the atmosphere to either transfer encrypted information or to intercept encrypted information. There's a lot of radar there that's like monitoring everything all the time. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a way or some sort of study that we don't know about that would try to figure out how to create a cloud that would then, channel electrons from the ionosphere and strike lightning down on a particular place. But I'm sure that's super sci-fi and kind of outside of our current technology, at least anything I know about. But theoretically, it could work. You would just have to figure out a mechanism for manipulating the cloud to create the humidity where you want it in order for the electrons to flow where you want it to go. And then you too can become Thor, the god of lightning.